to open this meeting of the Licensing Committee of the Board of Psychology, September 19th, 2016 in Sacramento, California. Could we please have a roll call so that we can establish a quorum here?
Phillips,
Yes.
Jones,
Good morning.
and Horn.
Here. Okay, we have a quorum. The entire committee is here. At this point in time, we're going to take public comments by anyone. For items that aren't on the agenda, we're not able to discuss these now, but the board will decide whether to put any comments you might have on a future agenda for discussion. So are there any comments from the public? Seeing none, let's move to section 3 of our minutes, of our agenda. Discussion of requests for extensions to accrue continuing education and exemptions to the CE requirements. So just as a little background, our Sunset Extension Bill 1193 has a section in there, 2915, that gives the board the authority to offer extensions to licensees to accrue the required number of CE hours for renewal. We had asked staff what kinds of requests come in and asked them to give us an idea of some pros and cons about whether to do this. So I'm going to open it up there and ask you all if you have any comments about this or recommendations about the pros and cons.
I was struck in reading the pros and cons and thinking about the situation that it would be, I'm not sure it's really fair to the licensees that break their back to comply within the allotted amount of time to allow for people to get extensions unless maybe under the most exceptional circumstances, such as severe disability or something like that. But just to have kind of a broad blanket authority to give extensions, I think would be inappropriate.
Ms. Jones?
I agree, and I support the action requested by staff.
I do as well. Staff is recommending that we don't pursue any regulatory changes to implement this. So do we have to move that? Ms. Marks, does this have to be a motion?
You generally do not need a motion to not do something. The only question would be whether or not you need to undo something. Is there something that needs to be undone?
No.
Then you do not need a
There
motion
is?
The extension language isn't already in SB 1193.
It is in 1190.
It is in there currently, yes.
Okay.
I believe it gives us the authority
gives us
to
the
do
authority.
it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So
It
if
doesn't
that's something
necessarily
that you want to keep in.
require us to do it.
That's right, yeah.
So I don't know that we have to make a motion, do we, Ms. Marks? If we've never had, we don't have to create, we weren't mandated to create the regulation.
So I think then Dr. Phillips is right. If you're not mandated to do it, then you don't need a motion to not act. However, you will need, when you're going through the CPD regs, to take a look at that particular section and decide what to do in order to change the language.
Okay, that sounds good. Thank you, Ms. Marks. So that's our recommendation. I'm wondering if there's any public comment about this. Seeing none, we're going to basically forward staff's recommendation, which we agree with at our next board meeting in November. So next are the approval of the minutes from the June 30th,
Just
July.
one more thing. There was a part 2 to this agenda item. Previously, the committee had asked, it's on page 2, it's on the back side
Oh,
of that
yeah,
page,
sorry.
the exceptions.
Thank you.
The committee had asked staff to provide examples of when people would request exceptions, but there's really only one way there's only one option that allows them to request one. So that language is included in there. They have to fit a certain criteria in order to request it. So I just provided that language in there so you guys can see what those requirements were.
So everybody who does request it basically tailors their request to the language that allows them to
Exactly.
request it, so, okay. Thanks, Ms. Noonan. All right, now we'll take a look at approval of the minutes for June 30th, July 1st, 2016. Are there any additions or corrections to these minutes? I did send in some additions and corrections, which I believe have been included here. I don't know if y'all did as well, but I think additions and corrections were included. Do you want to take a little while to read them, or why don't we go on to the next thing, and maybe when we have a break, we'll approve the minutes since we just got them in their final form today. Okay, so now we're going to move to agenda item number 5. Proposed new statutory language regarding coursework in suicide risk assessment and intervention. So, first of all, Ms. Johnson, I want to thank you for taking us through this again, and kind of walking down what we wanted to do. As everybody knows, Governor Brown vetoed a proposed legislation that would have mandated a course in suicide assessment and intervention, prevention, but also with a message to graduate programs and boards to basically take care of this. I mean, he didn't want to put an extra burden on programs, but wanted us to address this serious issue. So we've been taking a look at these things for a little while now to try to get language that doesn't place, as y'all know, first of all, we did a survey of graduate programs in psychology, doctoral programs in psychology, and found that, I can't remember the percentage now, but something like 98% of them have suicide assessment and intervention typically as part of the applied piece of their training program, so that would be in their practicum settings or their internship settings. And so we didn't want to put an extra burden or additional burden on those programs that are already doing this, or create, again, some hodgepodge addition to graduate school curricula. So we've been looking at a way to do that, and one of the ways that we thought is we wanted to take a look at the language for other one-time requirements for psychologists and see about sort of echoing or mimicking that language. And so the staff put together for 2915.4 coursework in suicide risk assessment and intervention. I asked y'all to take a look at that. I have a couple things I want to suggest about it, but let me put it to you first.
The primary comment I had is in subsection 1, where it says that a certification needs to come from the chief academic officer of the institution, I actually think it should say the chief academic officer or the registrar.
I think it should come from the director of training.
Of the
That's-
clinical field training.
Yeah, because that's the person who knows what is happening. It's not just field training, but there's directors of training in psychology departments and also in these applied experiences. So we could say, I don't think there's a chief academic officer in part, and I think what we want to say, we might say registrar but again, the registrars don't typically know the content areas of what's being taught. I think we're really looking at the people who are at the program level, either the applied training or in the graduate training itself, that know what's being taught, what that course content is.
I think at most, and this is just my experience, having taught a handful of APA-approved
Yeah,
graduate programs, that the registrars actually all receive and review the syllabi, because they go through the audit process for recertification as accredited institutions. So it is one of the things that they check for and ask people to include in the curriculum. So it's possible that the registrar might be in a position to do it, but I'm not certain that in every academic institution that would be true.
I'm looking for who would be most likely to, and again, I was saying earlier, in psychology, you're not typically going to get a course in suicide prevention and assessment. It's too narrow. You might get not that every program doesn't do it, but or all programs don't, I think maybe some do. You might get something in crisis intervention, or, so that's one, my thinking was who will be best who will know that?
I would agree with you that to the extent that there is a specific curricula, I'm sorry, okay. To the extent there's a specific curricula, I know I went through some of the internship programs I went through, there was an actual class in what to do with suicide assessment and intervention. So there would have been, there would have been an appropriate official from that internship.
Right, the internship is different. I mean, this isn't talking about an internship now.
Right.
And I think we probably want to add that.
That's what I was,
Yeah.
I guess I was seconding
Yeah.
that suggestion that perhaps we would want to add that
Right.
as an alternative way of getting certification.
Ms. Jones? Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. No, I was going to ask a different question, so it made sense to close that loop. I think that the other piece, again, Ms. Johnson, thank you for writing down everything here. I do think that for me, in my mind, before we even get to the language, I think that is the issue of this motion in general, because as a committee, we looked at this, and then our fellow board members said they did not want to proceed at all. And so I think that, and maybe it is about breaking it into the two things about the actual initial application and then the CPD portion of it, because I do think that the part that is kind of, I think maybe we should talk about it to be able to present to the full board in a different kind of way, because I felt like we had a very important conversation that covered a lot of territory, and I think that it does show in the transcript almost, or the minutes from the meeting, that I think that was the piece that if we approve it and move it again and it gets declined, I think that we need to figure out a way to discuss it, that what's the next steps, because I feel like in terms of what we were asked to do, they kicked it back to us.
Mhm.
This is no different than what we had before the May meeting. And so I think that's probably something that as a committee we need to look at, because looking at this language, it's actual language we didn't have at the May meeting, but it's the same content that's here.
So what are you saying? Because
I'm saying that I'm concerned that as a board, they kicked it back to us for specific reasons. And I feel like that is part of the conversation as opposed to just reviewing the language here. Because I think that if we approve language and it's the same thing, our board composition has changed since our May meeting. But I think that when I think back on that May 2nd meeting, they asked us to look at it from a different perspective. And I think at the time I was confused what that meant.
Yeah.
And I feel like if we start out looking at this draft language, we're still at that same point where they told us to kick it back to us.
So what's your understanding of what they ask us to address? Because I think it might be addressed in here if we add internship.
No, I think it was the 2 points. It was also about continuing education as well. So that was that part two from what I recall. But I don't know if someone else has a different opinion. But I feel like I guess in my mind I feel like it's the beginning part of the conversation, the contextual part of it, not just the language, because I feel like that seemed to be what was missing at the board meeting in May. And I know that for the conversation we had in our whatever meeting that was, April meeting here as a committee. I know you weren't part of that committee meeting, that part of the committee meeting, Dr. Phillips, but I feel like that we had a lot of conversation. I don't know if it's worth us talking about some of that stuff again because it's a reconstituted committee meeting. Does that make sense?
I think so, yeah.
And I'm just going to say what my recollection of what happened at the May meeting in Los Angeles of the entire board was that it didn't feel to me that the committee itself felt that the language that was being put forward covered all the aspects that they wanted, and in particular, I don't think that language covered CE, but I may be absolutely wrong in my recollection of that, but it felt like it hadn't been, that the language hadn't been completely drafted, and I think that was part of the reason I felt like it should go back to the committee. Now, I know there's also a group of people that object to the idea of doing another one-time requirement for continuing education, and that one-time requirement for continuing education would be burdensome or would be unnecessary for people that were experienced in the field. I think that's a separate discussion, but it does seem to me that this is a more, having looked back now on the summary of what happened at the meeting when I was absent that morning, I do think this is probably more reflective of everything that you guys had discussed at that meeting, from what I understood from the summary. And so I would feel more comfortable, this feels more complete to me, so I'd feel more comfortable taking it back to the board to see what the board's opinion was. I know that there are some stakeholders that might object to the idea of adding an additional education course, and that may lead to more discussion as to whether that should be included in here as well, or should continue to be included in here. So that's just my recollection of the board meeting in May, and as Ms. Jones pointed out, I was not privy to the discussion at the April committee meeting.
Okay. Ms. Hart?
I just wanted to give the committee a heads up on the legislative process and timing-wise for consideration before you move forward either way. This language is here for the committee's consideration. It would be brought back to the board at the November meeting. Bill introduction is in February, so if we wanted to find an author for the bill, and I know Assemblymember Levine has already expressed an interest in this issue, which is a great head start. But I just wanted to give you a heads up on the timing and the process before you consider the language.
Thank you. Ms. Jones?
Yeah, and Dr. Phillips, I agree with you, because we didn't have the language at the meeting. I do think, though, that part of the conversation was about the actual content, and regardless of the language being there or not. And so I just feel like I want to make sure, because as a committee, I don't think we even represented our committee meeting. I feel like we were kind of unclear, and perhaps it was because we didn't have draft language in front of us. But I just feel like I think it would be really important, because this would be over a year of work on this particular topic, that we actually have a conversation about language, but also about the content. Because I think that as a committee, if we're recommending it and it does pass unanimously, I feel like we then want to be able to communicate that to the full board, if that makes sense. I feel like, I don't know, I feel like we
When you're saying content, what do you mean?
about why it would be important to actually add this quote-unquote burden, which has been used in some cases, to require the requirement, you know? Because I think that based upon, as you just laid out, the beginning part of this language, the requirement for the application piece, we have found in our survey that that actually probably already happens, and so it was just us capturing it here. And I guess I just think that I didn't want to just jump to language, I wanted to have a discussion about the topic, I think, in my mind, because I feel like then that would help guide our work around the language. Because I feel like that was where it was almost like, let's start over again, back to the committee, when I think we've had several conversations about this, and I think that it just seems like we've started and stopped. And I just feel like if we could have a fuller conversation and really understand kind of, maybe it's about how we draft the language to actually explain the situation, or we then take some things out of the language and not just use this language. So I just feel like that's an important distinction, because I think that was kind of the way the conversation ended also, kicking it back to the committee does what differently if we're then using the language, because I know that we didn't have it in front of us, but I think that was kind of the direction. And I definitely like the language that was hand carried today better than was in the book.
Absolutely.
Ahead of time, but I just feel like, I just don't want us to lose that conversation is all I'm kind of saying. And maybe it's just the way I think about things differently, that I feel like to have the discussion and then do the language just seems more interesting, or more logical in my mind.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and if I'm accurate on this, maybe because of the kind of the way I work, if I can look at something and then go each piece of it and to say, this doesn't quite capture it, that might be, for me, I'm just saying, kind of a way to really address the issues that the board had.
And Chairperson, that would be real good for me, Dr. Horn. Can we then take it section by section as
Right,
opposed to having it
exactly.
open-ended with questions? That would help me.
Okay.
Okay, I just want to highlight that we know that suicide is a growing problem. We know that some concerns have been expressed about the comprehensiveness of what is presented in graduate programs. And I have to say, anecdotally, teaching in graduate programs, when I teach a law and ethics class and review suicide risk assessment and intervention, I find many of the students, it's been their first exposure to the material, even though they may have already been in a practicum site or something of that nature. I also think we don't know what necessarily happened for every psychologist in every graduate program that happened. I also remember some statistics that were in the summary that Dr. Harlem had brought to the last committee meeting that were quite disturbing in terms of people's feelings of proficiency around suicidality, risk assessment, intervention. So I'm in general I'm in favor of the general idea of making sure that both graduate programs and people that have already gone through graduate programs and are licensed are feeling very conversant in what to do when faced with a situation in order to help stem the tide. That's not to say that I don't think that most psychologists that do delivery of clinical services are not highly proficient in dealing with suicidality. I certainly think a lot of us see enough of it in our clinical practice and have had to deal with it. So have sought consultation and additional things in order to make sure that people are adequately protected in these circumstances. So I think there's a need for something, and I think, if I understand you correctly, Ms. Jones, what you're saying is you want to look at the piece as it relates to the graduate programs, and you'd also like to look separately at the question of whether there's a need for a continuing education requirement.
No, I'm saying that we need to look at that I feel like we want to, as a committee, look through this in a more in-depth, so that, because it's beyond the language, I think, of the actual statutory language. I think it was also the way in which it was framed, and to talk about what we believe is important. I think, like you started off by saying, suicide's a very important issue. And so basically I feel like it's almost putting it in the context of a response to the governor's veto in a lot of ways. That this is our action as a result of this. And like I said, I guess the concern I have is that, for the year, it's been volleyed back and forth, and I think that's the part that I've made, and I think that you solved it for me, Dr. Horn, if we could look at it line by line, as opposed to just open-ended, because then I think that we would get to that distinction of the graduate level programs and then the continuing education or continuing professional development.
And I'm really comfortable with that approach, so I think we're all on board in terms of how we're going to do it.
So why don't we start, let's take a look at, we'll just start with the Part A. Completed a minimum of 6 contact hours of coursework in suicide risk assessment and intervention. Do we want to put a number of hours on it? I mean, let's just start there.
I think it makes sense to put a number of hours. I'm not sure what contact hours means in this context. Does it mean it's a live class that they took?
See, that's how I read contact hours. 6 contact hours of coursework is how I read that. It's a class, it's a course, it's a workshop. And I'm not sure that's what we want to say.
Because, I mean, it's possible that in some programs, they might have this as being, some of the schools that have multiple campuses will have online courses where you're not actually face-to-face or shoulder-to-shoulder, as Ms. Johnson might say, with the instructor, but you're taking an active course in suicide assessment and intervention. So, I think
I think contact hours could be distance. I mean, I don't think that, it's just like any of moving ahead CPD, that can happen in distance, but I don't, when we say coursework, then we're leaving out the possibility of, it's not like, say, in an internship, there aren't courses, because I certainly had courses that were taught to me in my internship around certain issues, or psychologists have that around certain issues. But it might not be 6 contact hours of coursework. It might be you have an hour and a half or 2 hours of talking about suicide or something like that. Then you work with people and you apply it. I mean, I don't know, I'm making up the numbers, but in an internship, in an applied experience, it's not always 6 hours of coursework.
Looking at our other requirements for curriculum or training requirements, Business and Professions Code Section 25, that requires the human sexuality training requirement. The language in our regulations says a minimum of 10 contact hours, so it was probably just being consistent with our other training requirements. And then in child abuse assessment 1382.4, it says 7 instructional hours, so that's described differently, something for consideration.
But both of those are about coursework. They're actual courses that have to be taken. And I think we are not wanting to say that you have to have a course, specific course in this. There are multiple ways. So, and coursework would be one.
What if it were to say 6 hours of coursework and/or applied intervention under the supervision of a licensed psychologist? I don't know how you want to put that, but
And/or applied experience. or
applied
something.
experience under supervision.
What do you think, Ms. Jones?
So I don't have that document, but so I'm going to ask staff, because maybe someone will recall. In our survey, though, did we find that that coursework was a way in which institutions were delivering suicide
The
risk
bulk,
assessment?
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
The bulk of people were getting it actually in their applied training. So internships versus an actual course. The majority, I mean, it's not that there weren't, some programs talked about having, again, courses that included that, but that wasn't the main thing.
I think most institutions, if I recall correctly, said that it was spread out over a number of different
Right.
courses, the clinical interviewing course and
Right.
professional development courses and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it's not even clear that there's a, when I went to graduate school, I actually did take a weekend course in suicidality, but I know that the program that I attended doesn't even offer that course anymore. So I think it's kind of more diffusely spread out across the curriculum.
So maybe if we took out contact and just say 6 hours of coursework and/or applied experience under supervision in suicide risk assessment and intervention. Ms. Jones?
6 hours of coursework.
I'm sorry?
6 hours of coursework
And/or applied experience under supervision. And take out the contact, just say 6 hours. And then this requirement may be met in one of, now we want to say 3 ways. Right, so one will be as part of the graduate training program. And we're not saying it has to be a course, but it could be spread across the curriculum. But they're going to get that. And then somebody has to verify that. And that's what we want to, that's where we got hung up a little. So do we want to say the program director, the training director, the registrar? I mean, you know.
Well, I would think if it's an academic institution, we would want to say the chief academic officer or the registrar. For instance, if you look at Alliant,
Yeah.
their chief academic officer is in San Francisco and does not necessarily know what's going on in each respective campus in terms of what
Right.
coursework is happening. It
Right.
wouldn't be meaningful. It would be more likely that a registrar or a program director or the head of clinical field training.
See, I think it ought to be, again, the closer to it, that's right. And chief academic officers, as far as I know, they're not in say, a university setting where you have a psychology department. I mean, you do have a registrar of the university, but that chief academic officers, so it's different in professional school versus a university. So I think we have to. So registrar is going to be on every campus, regardless, right?
And there's typically a clinical field training director, I think, on every campus.
Well, it depends. It might be a director of training is what that person might be called.
So maybe training director?
Training director, yeah. Registrar or training director of the educational institution or program, I guess, right?
or program.
That's what I'm asking. Because the training director would be of the program. So of the institution or the program in which the person graduated.
It depends, I think it depends on the institution.
Yeah.
Some of them would have a different training director for the PhD program, as opposed to if they also had a parallel PsyD program. Some of them might have a training director that covers all the programs.
Okay, so let's say institution or program from which the applicant graduated, stated that the,
Can I ask a question as we think about the categories of people? Does anyone recall who the survey was completed by at the institutions that we surveyed? Because I just.
they were directors of training, because it went out on the APIC listserv, that's where we got the, and so these are training directors of training. Yeah.
So it seemed as though if we had those folks responding, that it seemed like that would be
Yeah,
the person. Although I do know in some academic institutions, you know, the whole process of approving a syllabus and looking at curriculum, somebody higher might know that also. But if we have that group already responding, it sounds like that might be a good group to.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that sounds good. I didn't even think of it. Of the educational institution or program from which the applicant graduated, stating that the coursework required by this section is included with the institution's curriculum for graduation or within the coursework. Don't have that comma there. That was completed by the applicant. So it's not saying it has to be a course, but it is saying it's in there. And this person had to have it to graduate, or if not to graduate, that person did have it. Okay. Now, number 2, I think we want to put that applied experience. Number 3 should be continuing education. So we want to say obtained as part of, do we want to say practicum or internship? Or other applied, you know. Placement.
Well,
We could say practicum experience, internship, could be postdoc even, or postdoc experience. All of those are applied experiences, and I think those, any of those should be okay.
I would think so. And we do, and there is a way that the regulations, if I recall correctly, do anticipate that some people are going to get all of their hours postdoc. There's a
That's
potential
right,
to get all
that's right.
3,000 hours postdoc.
Right,
So we would, I don't think we would want to leave postdoc out of it.
right,
Um,
correct, yeah.
Can I just suggest that we say a general comment in the beginning and then define applied experience? So that number 2 would read, obtained as part of his or her applied experience. Applied experience requirement can be met in any of the following 3 ways: formal internship, practicum, postdoc, so that it's clear.
Okay. That sounds all right with me.
So that's going up in
So this will be under 2. So obtained as part of his or her applied experience,
Period. And then applied experience.
right,
Okay.
can be met by any of the following 3 categories?
Sure.
Or from any of the following 3 categories? Is it settings, following 3 settings or categories? What makes more sense?
It can be met in any of the following 3 settings.
In any of the following 3 settings, okay.
And then a colon.
Yeah.
Well, we've added or other applied placement, so that would include something like being a registered psychologist or whatever name we potentially give to the
That's right.
registered psychologist.
Mhm.
It could also mean a psychological assistantship.
Mhm.
And the reason I say that in particular is there are students who are attending institutions where they cannot get an internship because of the nature of the institution.
Mhm.
And they're out there getting their hours, and they're probably only able to get them in a psychological
You're right,
assistantship.
you're right.
So,
Currently.
I don't know if we want to be explicit about that.
So would it be any of the following settings and then it would be
Yeah,
more?
let's just say any, yeah, can be met in any of the following settings. And then we can say practicum.
Want to start with practical?
Yeah, just use the word.
Practicum,
I would just say practicum, period,
Yeah.
or comma.
practicum. I'd say formal postdoctoral,
Do you want to do a blanket statement, just
postdoctoral
supervised
placement?
professional experience, which might encompass being a psych assistant or a postdoc or pre-doc, if you just said as part of their supervised professional experience?
I'm sorry?
Do you want to just do a blanket as part of their supervised professional experience, instead of, saying psych assistant
That's
and
good.
postdoc?
Thank
So
you, that's
you
good.
might say, in terms
Or
of the
formal
supervised professional
SPE.
experience.
Yeah. That would be the psych assistant or the registered psychologist or.
That would not include though, however, well, is practicum considered supervised
No, no, no,
professional
no.
experience?
So that's why we need to say that. We need to list some things. Formal internship isn't either, so we need to list those. But, and postdoc isn't necessarily either if it's a
Those
formal
2011
postdoc.
internships?
I mean, it counts as SPE, but we really, no, I don't think we want to, because practicum doesn't count. Yeah.
But you list that separately.
I actually got most of the, in applied settings, I got the most education about suicide risk and assessment in practicum. We spent, I think, a weekend on it again. Of course, been
So,
more nervous
I mean,
about
it's
practicum.
coming, it's typically coming in those applied experiences, but we want to make sure we're not leaving any out. In practicum, it doesn't count toward SPE.
Is it around? Okay. I just meant more, if you're going to say psychological assistance and postdoc and all of that, I would say maybe supervised professional experience. I didn't mean to replace it with practicum.
So we said practicum, formal internship, take out the or before postdoc and say formal postdoctoral experience. Or other applied,
Okay.
or what, how would you say it? Or other experience, for SPE experience.
Or qualifying supervised.
Others,
Qualifying SPE.
Yeah.
Thank you, Karen. I mean, Ms. Johnson.
I think it should say, where it says formal postdoctoral experience, that could mean a lot of different things. I would
Okay.
think we'd really want to say
In a
formal
formal postdoc?
postdoctoral internship or fellowship.
Okay. Postdoc typically aren't called internships.
Some of them are.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay,
Would it be easier,
formal postdoctoral.
because I'm not sure if there's a definition anywhere in statute or reg that defines a formal internship? Do you want to refer to internships that meet the definition of 2911? So those are the APIC, KPIC
Yeah,
settings?
Yeah.
Would that be
yes,
more exact?
yeah, that'd be fine.
So, for the second one, Jason, for internships that meet the requirements of section 2911.
So it's a formal internship.
How about formal postdoctoral placement?
Okay, I'm good with that.
Okay.
Experience sounds kind of
Yeah,
vague.
yeah.
Sounds like going to Disneyland.
But in terms of back to Ms. Mark's comment, I know that I don't see placement, I just see formal postdoctoral internship listed. And what's currently here.
So just say placement, and leave out internship or fellowship. Is that okay? Where do you see?
No, I'm
where
saying
you see
we
it?
have internship here in the, placement.
Formal postdoctoral
Internship.
overseen by APIC or KPIC. Are you not talking about pre-doctoral? Or called the intern?
Well,
have placement. So take out, after postdoc, take out internship or fellowship and just put in placement. And then oh, well, I guess you can put or other qualifying supervised professional experience.
And should supervised professional experience, is it capitalized in the regs, or is it just only?
I'd capitalize it, just to. In regs, we can capitalize it, can't we?
Are there formal postdoc placements that don't meet the definition under 2911?
I don't have 2911 in front of me, does 2911?
2911's fine, we can do 2911. It's, thank you, I forgot to bring my book too. Do we have any extra?
Yeah, 2911 would require, I believe, if I'm reading it correctly, that it has to be one of the approved programs from the American Psychological Association, APIC or APIC.
That's fine.
Now, there is discussion later on in the regulations of taking out that requirement. That's another discussion
Yeah,
they
we'll
have.
have that later.
But,
We're gonna have that later.
but I think,
Yeah, meets the, or other qualifying supervised professional experience. Good.
What do you, just to, want to say internship or formal postdoc? Internship or formal postdoc placement that meets the requirements of 2911, so you don't have to say it twice?
Yeah.
so the section 2911, then, as I understand it, would apply to both the internship and the formal postdoctoral placement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And Mr. Glassbeagle, not that it necessarily matters, in 2911, postdoctoral is not hyphenated, just FYI. Which maybe we might need to
Yeah,
hyphenate.
Yeah,
yeah,
might as well
yeah,
make
I
it
think we've had
consistent
this
for us.
discussion before. Let's start hyphenating.
One more.
All right, so now we're on number 3, which used to be number 2. By taking a continuing education course.
Well, can I interrupt for a second? So how are they, on number 1,
Oh,
you said how
the
they're gonna be
same way.
certified.
Yeah. For those placements, you want it to be the director of training, for sure, right? For placement, director of placement, field placement, or director of training.
I think you'd actually want it to be the director of the training at the internship or site.
Absolutely,
Yeah, so, yeah.
yeah. So the director of training doesn't necessarily need to be, well, yeah, yeah.
So, well, go ahead.
No,
I was just picking up your comment, because the way we've written the other one is educational institution. Are you saying placement site?
Yeah. So that it would be similarly for it to be, I guess, to satisfy this, I don't know if to satisfy this requirement, the applicant shall submit to the board a certification from the director of training of the placement, practicum, or other supervised professional experience. I'm getting lost. I'm getting lost. So how are we getting certification? We need certification language.
Right. I'd say director of training or, because we're saying any qualifying SPE, so that would be primary supervisors, directors of training.
Licensed psychologists, some of them would be just licensed psychologists that have psychological assistants, so they're not.
Right, they're the
I'm not-
primary
I'm not gonna call myself director of training in my
Right,
office.
exactly.
Although I may start doing that, I like it, the sounds of it.
Director of training or supervisor responsible,
For primary.
primary supervisor.
Do we need to say, or from the primary supervisor where the qualifying experience has occurred or something to kind of qualify it?
Where the SPE has occurred. Because they may think it's a primary supervisor of the internship, and that might. or-
Again, practicum's not SPE.
That's right. So it's or the primary supervisor. Practicum would be the director of training or whatever.
So Ms. Sork, the concept you're trying to get is that it needs to be the director of training or whoever the primary supervisor was, where the person got the actual training, and not have someone 2 internships later signing something saying that, oh, they've had experience with this.
But that could be okay, because sometimes it's like, yes, this is a regular part of our program, and this person attended, the practicum. I think that could absolutely be. That might be the director of training who does that.
Oh,
But it
yeah,
might be
I'm not-
after the person has.
I'm not disagreeing with this, but I think it has to be where they got the experience. So in other words, if they got it in their psych assistantship, it needs to come from their licensed supervisor. If they got it at a practicum, it needs to be the director of training at the practicum. So I think adding where the qualifying experience has occurred captures the fact that you don't want somebody who hasn't, let's say that.
Where the
there wasn't-
qualifying coursework has occurred. Or right, that's what we're saying, where it happened, where you got this requirement met.
Right. Where the
Ms.
qualifying experience or coursework has occurred?
What Dr. Horn just said struck something for me. We basically are certifying the experience, right? I mean, so
Right.
it doesn't matter if it's the person at that location. And so like you were saying, that the director of training would need to know kind of the whole, what everything was covered. And so, because we're not really capturing where people got it from in the application process, we're certifying that it was completed. So I kind of feel like maybe your suggestion is more direct, because the idea is that we want to make sure it was completed.
Right.
And they're certifying under penalty of perjury that it was done.
Right, and the director of training can contact a practicum site and say, hey, right. It could be from their program, it could be, if it's an internship, it'll have a different director. It'll be the director of training for the internship, or,
I think we have to remember that there are programs where, for instance, there might be over 100 PsyD students who are at 80 different sites. I'm not sure the director of training at that institution is going to know that each of those institutions is offering a course in particular in that. Some of the programs, and these haven't been the programs that I've been affiliated with, but some of the programs basically say go out and find yourself an internship, and then we'll approve it, and that's about all they know about the internship. So
right now, what we're saying is it's APA, APIC, or KPIC.
Right.
That's what we're counting,
okay,
as internship.
right,
Otherwise, it's gonna be, these people are gonna be psych assistants.
or
and-
registered psychologists.
Yeah, registered psychologists, and then we're gonna have their primary supervisor be the one who does it. Right?
Okay,
Does that make sense? But a lot of times people can, if it's still attached to a program like formal internships are, then the director of training in the program can absolutely know what those people are getting.
so when we say director of training, are we saying director of training from an academic institution, or are we saying director of training from the site at which they achieved the experience? Or are we saying both?
I think we're saying both. It depends.
Okay.
I think we're saying it depends. So I don't want there to be confusion. I know how anxious people get when there is confusion.
I think we need to be clear in the language.
And I guess, I mean, and as you were just describing that, Dr. Phillips, I think that is something that it would be important to be clear and to know that that might require folks to track differently as
Right.
well.
Mhm.
So in terms of them being able to identify what's been going on, I'm sure that would change how they would then capture data. But
Or they would
I
say,
agree.
you're gonna need to go to the placement because we don't know that they did this at the placement. So I think the fact they're certifying under penalty of perjury may say, so you need to go back to whatever, wherever you get that supervised professional experience and get the director of training to sign off there because
Yeah.
we're not tracking. So I
But for all the other things that happen, do they have that kind of communication with the placement already?
It really does depend on the institution, and I don't want to draw a distinction between accredited and unaccredited institutions. The examples I know are some unaccredited institutions, not all unaccredited institutions, where basically they just kind of sign off when the person brings them an internship they found on their own, and they have little or no contact with them until they receive back from them a certification at the end that they did the required number.
So then it's gonna be the primary supervisor, because those do not qualify under 2911.
Right.
2911. So they don't qualify as an internship. They may call them an internship, but they don't qualify under 2911. So then we're talking about, again, psych assistant or registered psychologist, then we're talking about the primary supervisor,
Okay.
right?
And I don't mean to be overly picky or picayune about this, but there are situations sometimes where people have a primary supervisor at a site.
That's right.
3 years later, they're doing their application and they want to get the certification. They have not gotten the certification letter yet. They go back to the site, the primary supervisor just no longer works there.
That's right.
May be out of state, may not be contactable, may have passed away. So I think we should say director of training at the academic institution or director of training at the supervised professional experience or primary supervisor.
This is why it's a good thing for people to bank their credentials because of things like this. But that's a whole nother.
Yeah, and I would say to add something to a whole other issue, I know that we've talked about this a couple of times about helping and providing information to help supervisors be better supervisors. Some of this also would fall into that category in terms of how you track that. But I do think that that is important to realize. That would be important in how you implement this, but it sounds like we also have quite a few other items that we want to make sure we kind of educate folks
Right.
that are being supervisors, that this would be part of that if this gets adopted.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
So perhaps when they sign off on their hours at the end of their internship, there should also be another form where they're certifying the experience. So maybe it's a question of what forms we ask them to submit to us or to sign off on at the end of the supervised professional experience.
Well, I mean, they may develop their own form.
Yeah,
that
forms or
says,
guidance.
This is part of the thing, I just want you to know now.
It's a letter of
law-
it could be a letter of
Yeah, it could be a
certification,
letter,
yeah.
it could be anything. So we are now, what are we gonna say here? To satisfy this requirement, applicant shall submit to the board certification of training from the director of training or primary supervisor where the qualifying experience has occurred.
That to me sounds like you cannot get it from the director of training
Of the program.
of the program.
I would take out, I would just say, or director, or primary, director of training for the program, you could say, or primary supervisor where the qualifying experience has occurred. How about that?
And can we strike certification of training to certification
Yeah,
from?
certification
Or take
from.
off the of training.
Right,
I'm going to ask this.
Certification. How about attestation or something like that? Is certification the same thing as attestation?
Maybe we'd have to defer to Ms. Marks as to, I think my legal vocabulary is faded enough that.
I think certification is the word we tend to use, if you're, I don't know if you're trying to get this to be as complete as possible to avoid the need for regs. But I think certification is a term we tend to use if you want it under penalty of perjury. I think you'd either have to say it, because I don't know if a certification implies that or not. I'd have to look at that, or you'd have to do regs.
Actually, the word attestation to me conjures up images of an oral statement made by somebody in a legal setting.
Okay, I don't like certification of training, I agree with Ms. Jones. Certification by itself just sounds, submit to the board a certification,
A written certification?
written certification.
Well, we have that in the section above too, though, right? We have certificate, I was also just, when we talk about number 1,
Yeah,
so I would seem like if you want to be consistent,
yeah, let's be
on
consistent.
either way, we do that one.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it looks clear to me in
Yeah.
the first one, it does seem a little
Yeah.
clunky there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Does that sound good?
I just want to ask Ms. Johnson a question, and that is, we have run into experiences before where people are trying to get their hours signed off on by their primary supervisor, and I think the regulations have been changed or are in the process of being changed, so there can also be the formal director of training at that institution that could sign off on those hours. Would we want to do something parallel here, where primary supervisors come and go, primary supervisors have sometimes bad relationships after they've left institutions, or I had a primary supervisor that, not during the period of time I had him, but died in the middle of a year.
This is not uncommon, for folks. Well, let's have Ms. Johnson answer.
Well, the regulations are going to be changed where they'll be giving the trainee the documentation at the completion of the experience. So that might avoid that type of situation where someone's moved and they're unable to get a hold of their primary
So it would be within the control of the
trainee.
trainee to be able to get it signed off at the same time they get anything
Correct.
else signed off, or ask
Mhm.
for the letter of certification
Mhm.
at that time.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Okay.
Where are the qualifying period? Okay, that's number 2. That seemed good to you, Ms. Jones? Okay. Let's go to number 3.
Actually, I think it should be, the two should be the same.
And then or.
Yeah.
The or from number 1 should now move down to 2.
Thank you.
Should one end with a period?
No, semicolon. Or, by taking a continuing education course, or do we want to say continuing ed, or do we want?
Can I just make a comment really
Oh,
quick?
Absolutely.
In order to keep 1 and 2 in conformance, you're also, the written certification needs to say what it's stating. So like it's stating that the coursework required by this section is included within the institution's curriculum, and 2, it would be it's included within the experience.
Okay.
So we just might want to make sure we
Yeah.
add that in there.
Would we want to do that in statute or regulation?
You're just
Well,
mirroring
we're
1.
just mirroring 1. Thanks,
Oh,
Sharice.
okay.
Because otherwise you're certifying, what are you certifying?
Yeah, great, thank you.
More than 2 or more.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Because we have other.
Right, okay. Okay, so she's going to help him with that, to change that.
Great.
Okay. So now, by taking a continuing education course that meets the requirements of section 2915C 2 or 3. Do we want to say CPD? What if they get it as part of, if they get it, or do we just want to make it a one-time course?
And CPD
Yeah.
is part of the new 2 and 3,
Yeah.
so that's why we wanted
Oh,
to
okay.
cover it there.
So I think we are saying, we still do use the word continuing relates to the formal coursework
Yeah,
that people are getting up to potentially 27 hours with.
right.
So I think we want to keep it as a continuing education
Okay.
course.
So I have a question, because I think when I reviewed my notes before, did we, for previous items like this, was it separated out coursework and continuing ed? Was it always together?
Always together.
Always together.
Yeah.
Because the whole 3 ways, anyway, I just wanted to make sure
Yeah.
that was the case.
So we just want to make sure you have to have this. If you don't get it in your training, then you're going to have to take it before you can renew your license.
So-
Or before you get your first license.
So the way I read this, because there's nothing about renewal until below that, that's why I was thinking, like, so if I was a person renewing in 3 ways, well, if you're an applicant, you're not gonna be completing continuing education, right?
Correct.
That's
Well,
what-
actually, you can take, if I recall correctly, I actually took I don't know if it was a domestic violence course or one of the courses that was required in order to get licensure. It was actually a continuing education course I paid for. The
Okay.
hours didn't count toward anything because I wasn't licensed yet. But I did actually take the continuing education course.
It makes sense to me.
Prior to
Bruce.
licensure,
Yeah.
and some people have to do that.
I was reading this incorrectly, no, it makes
Okay.
sense, the 3 ways. Because that's different than, yes, continuing education course would seem consistent with the work we've changed. So, yeah, I'm good with it, I'm sorry.
And I did want to mention that now that we've clarified A, and we're going to potentially, we'll keep or not keep B, but if we assume we keep A and B, when we take it back to the board, if the board says we're on board with A, but we're not on board with B,
Mhm.
because of the different considerations about continuing education for existing licensees, I think it'll be easier to parse it out.
I think that would be in our motion as a board, a committee meeting as we end, because I would say, I don't agree with that. And so I think as a committee, what we took
yeah.
to the board was the motion from the committee.
Oh, I would
And so
agree,
then
yeah.
we should do that as a motion, because I feel like our conversation, it would be together in my mind, but I think that maybe that was part of the challenge at the board meeting. But we didn't
I would-
take that as a motion.
I would agree with Ms. Jones. We should definitely take it as a complete package and not suggest that
Exactly.
it can be cherry picked.
Exactly
But then the
right.
board can have their discussion and then we can see where we are.
Yeah. But this is it's going to be our recommendation. Whatever we end up with, we'll make a motion and all like that. But we still got more to go, so. Okay, so Part B, effective January 1st, 2020, all licensees must complete as a requirement for the first renewal after the effective date of this section, a one-time 6-hour course in suicide risk assessment and intervention that meets the requirements of 2915 C2 or 3. So if you're already licensed, you can either show, let me ask, just kind of want to think about this, particularly if you're an early career psychologist or something, you're already licensed, you may be able to get some of this earlier experience certified. You can just have your director of training or something send it in, or you can go ahead and take a course if it's, you know, in that on or whatever, right?
That's what I was, when I was reading it, that was my question earlier, but then I saw the separation.
Yeah.
So I have a question. So if a licensee would have met the requirement of A at the time that they applied for licensure, are we still requiring them?
That's what I just said.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I got distracted by something, but
What I'm saying is, because that's what I would, if they can produce proof of any of these things before renewal, then I wouldn't think they would have to take a course.
take additional coursework.
That's how I'm thinking about it. And that's why I said particularly early career psychologists, but, you know, people have gotten it as part of their training and thinking or whatever. Ms. Jones?
And I think that is in line with the whole survey, right, that we see that
Right.
it is there, and I think that, I don't know how we would do the language for it, but I would wonder I think the idea behind this conversation was those that never had it should have it.
Mhm.
And if you are in this group that's now, you may have had it.
Right.
You probably did have it, according to our survey.
Right, according to our survey. So we may want to, I think we might want to say they must either demonstrate that they've had it or must complete as a requirement, you have to take this course. You can either go back to your graduate program and say, I want to show evidence that I've done this already, that's fine, then you need it even though it's licensure renewal. But if they can't do that, I've been working for 50 years and I have a lot of experience in this, well, sorry, or it'd be the same kind of thing that other people ask for exemptions. This is what I do, I teach this, I blah, blah, blah. We'd have our regular way of exempting.
So it would be something like all licensees must demonstrate in a written form completion of this, of A, prior to licensure?
Yeah. Either they're going to go back to get the proof that they had this. So
Right.
demonstrate by one of the above things, or, again, failing that, you got to take this one time 6 hours course.
I have a quick question on how they're gonna demonstrate it, because right now we don't require any proof of their CE, they're just certifying on their renewal that they have it. So would your idea be that they would just certify that they have had this training at one point in time, or they have taken a course, and then if they're audited, they would either show one of those two?
They'd have to show.
So they must certify.
Yeah.
But I can imagine a situation where somebody went to graduate school 25 years ago, certify that they did have this training then.
Mm-hmm. But have no way to prove it.
And then go back to their postdoc or pre-doc or to and the program doesn't exist anymore because the mental health center.
Well, then they're going to take the course. I mean, that's what happened to a lot of people when human sexuality came, when child abuse came. It's like you couldn't get the proof, so people ended up taking them, even though they had them, even though, all this kind of stuff. That is what happens.
Well, here's the situation I'm envisioning. They certify it because
Yeah.
it's true. They
Yeah.
did have that training. And then there's an audit, and we ask for
So we're going to have to
proof.
say must be able to demonstrate, and demonstrate it upon the board's request or something, just like we do the other CE, I think. They certify, but we do say you have to show us that you had these other, these courses. They're still certifying, but they have to have human sexuality, they have to have,
So do we need to warn them that they need to have some kind of written document to back that up?
I think we should.
Yeah, I think
Just
we
like we
should,
do
too.
everything else, you have to have, if you say you have it, you have to be able to demonstrate you've had it.
And again, I think that goes back to this notion of how we notify and educate. So that sounds like that would be a couple of newsletter articles if this were to pass. But I do think, Mr. Meehan, we actually require people, we put on there that you have to have, while you're certifying, you have to have proof that you are that it matches your certification, right?
The question, the renewal just requests that they certify how many hours of CE they have. It doesn't specify that they have to have documentation to back it up, but it is a requirement and a regulation that states they have to maintain their documentation.
Right.
So while it doesn't say it on the actual renewal, it's still a regulation, and people ask about it all the time. How do I show or prove to the board that I have this? And I just let them know you have to maintain your documentation if we do request it.
And just, not to take us off, but in terms of that, to make that change, is that a regulatory change of the form, or to put that on there in terms about reminding people about documentation?
Well, we already have it in the CPD regulations, and the new regulations is it says they have to maintain their documentation for a
Right,
period.
we could have it on there.
Right, yeah, we already have that on there, so, I'm assuming this would have to be explicit in how they must show proof in this particular section.
Yeah. And I would support doing that, and then I also think that we should add continuing education before course, to stay consistent with the A3, I guess it is.
A one-time, 6-hour continuing education.
So subsection, so 2915 C2 or 3, the C2 talks about CE, but C3 talks about academic coursework, because we're allowing that in CPD, so it doesn't have to
Right.
be a CE course. That's why we kept CE out of it.
Okay,
That's why we didn't specify a one-time CE
Okay.
course,
because we said 2 or 3, and
Correct.
one is continuing and the other's actual
Academic.
academic
Mhm.
coursework.
Well, then, should we then take off course or 6 hours of CPD? Because otherwise, if it's a course, it would be the coursework, right?
Well, here we're not saying that they can take any category, or they can take any course within
No, but
CPD. It has to be
we're-
specifically from section C2 or 3.
We actually have it spelled out here, though, because we say you can take a course as part of your degree program, you can get your applied experience, or you can take a CE course, so.
No, I got it. Then we would strike out course in the bottom if it's all those categories. And I'm just saying 6 hours.
Oh, right.
I'm just saying
Yeah.
it wouldn't be, it's either a coursework or it's not a course,
I
if
mean,
it's everything.
Yeah, a one-time,
Well, academic, it would be a course, because CE is a course, and so is academic. It would be a course.
But if what we're saying, I think, if I'm understanding Ms. Jones correctly, is if we're saying you have to demonstrate the 1, 2, or 3, then
I
we've
see what you're
already
saying.
included continuing
Right.
education course.
That makes
So
sense. Okay.
we don't need to repeat it again.
okay. Okay, so all licensees must complete a requirement, or must show evidence that they have completed, yeah, the required 6 hours. In any of those ways of that, right? How
So
do
we're
we want-
anticipating must show evidence or must have evidence, and they're gonna certify.
Well, they have to have it, I guess, because we don't, you know. Yeah, they're gonna certify it, but they have to have the evidence if they're asked for it.
Isn't that the same as all other CE requirements? So do you necessarily, if you're saying it already needs to meet the requirements and it's a CE requirement, I'm not sure if you need to repeat that?
Well, I would say that they have, because not everybody's gonna have to show proof that they've gotten this training unless they're audited. So I think it would make more sense to say that they have to certify it and be able to retain documentation to back it up. Because not everyone's gonna be required to show evidence.
Right.
And can we just put that language in there that they must certify and maintain documentation of? That's just an easy way.
Provided to the board upon request. So it parallels the other processes.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Just
Okay.
nice and clean.
yeah, that'd be nice.
You gonna help him?
Yeah, just put random words in.
So, it looks like folks are taking breaks, and we'll get to you in just a second. Because I'm just looking at the time, it's already 11:30, I don't know what time we're gonna break for lunch. I think we wanna finish this, but do we wanna take maybe a 5-minute break? And then we'll come back and we'll get public comment and stuff like that. All right? Okay, everybody, I think we're gonna get back in, we're gonna go back in session after a little break here. Let's kind of figure out what we want to say on this last thing, and the thought occurred to me, and I think to a couple of others while we were taking our break. Because we are making this a one-time requirement, I think we want to have, if it's for licensure renewal, we don't want people just to certify that they've taken all the required CE. I think we want to have, to say with their renewal, they have to send in proof. Because otherwise, you know, we only audit 10% of the, you know, of the licensees each time, and we are saying this is a requirement, and so we want to.
And it's one time.
And it's a one-time requirement.
Not
And
every
exactly, it's
renewal.
not every time, so it's a different kind of a thing. So I think we want to, if it is for licensure renewal, they have to
Yes, submit the written documentation.
submit the documentation.
And may I just make a suggestion that we've kind of redone some wording, and there's a second B now on the screen. if you'd like to start from there, where it's complete the one time, and then you can modify that, certify and maintain documentation. You can put submit documentation of the completion.
Very good. So, but we want to say, we don't want to say certify and
Yeah.
maintain. Now we want to say.
Or submit.
Must complete and submit. We want to take all that last part out. Or certify. Or 3. And then, no, leave it in or 3, and then, but take out from or certify to the end. And then I think we want to say,
Do we need to take all that language?
No.
suicide risk assessment and intervention meets the requirements of section da-da-da-da, and submit documentation of, or certain, you know, we want them to submit to us, submit proof of compliance.
But aren't you submitting proof of compliance with A1 or 2? That you completed it
Or
through that
3.
coursework? Well, 3 is what you've already said, is to complete the one-time 6-hour coursework. So B mirrors A3. So you can take the one-time 6-hour CE that meets that, or you're submitting proof of compliance with A1 or 2.
Well, actually, but we're just saying that it should
No?
just be a
That's
course.
different. Yeah.
It shouldn't be just a course, because actually, as a person who's applying for the first time, you can either do a continuing education course or A or B.
Okay.
If you're renewing, then you're doing 6 hours of CPD.
Ah, okay.
So really, which,
Or they can demonstrate that they had this in their graduate program or whatever.
so I think it
Yes.
says, as a requirement for the first renewal after the effective date of this section,
Right.
all licensees must submit proof of compliance at the time of renewal.
Perfect.
Are we going to be holding up renewals to verify that every single person has taken this?
They have to submit it with their renewal.
So we would be doing a 100% audit on this for the first time renewal? Because a lot of the renewals go straight to our central
Can they-
cashiering. It doesn't come through the board. And they might detach them,
They do, they don't take a look at any of the attachments. They just take the little slip and run it through an automated, I didn't think about that.
Well, then how do we do it when there's a requirement anytime? How do we know that
They-
they've met the requirement?
We haven't had that so far.
We did a long time ago.
yeah, they just certified, they just checked that they took that course. But didn't submit that, they didn't have to attach the documentation with their renewal.
Well,
Pre-licensure is much easier. We have their application for licensure, and that's just one of the requirements that they must submit that documentation to us before we'll issue the license. Now, renewals are a different situation. For every renewal, if we require that they submit the documentation and we start holding renewals until staff can go through each one of those to certify, it's just going to hold up all of the renewals, until we figure out some kind of process if we want to make sure that they're documenting this. Just something to consider.
And,
Oh, it's
and if they were to,
important.
if they were to renew online, they would then have to upload the document at the time they would do it, but you would have to.
We would still have to do a
You'd
100%
have to
audit.
clear the document before you could allow the renewal to go
Right.
through. Because as it stands right now, doing a renewal online takes.
automatic.
and it's-
2
it-
seconds.
Seconds.
Yeah, you do it in 2 seconds, and then like a day or two later, your
You're
dates
renewed.
are on there, which is great.
We'd have to create a hold or something if they don't upload the document. We'd have to be able to look at it and see that it meets the requirement.
So if we had them certify,
Yeah. And
I'm
that's-
just trying to think,
Yeah.
how do we guarantee that people have met this? They certify it separate from maybe the other CE stuff. There's an extra box, I've had this course,
Mhm.
and they must keep the documentation
For written submittal to the, or submission to the board upon request.
upon request. And that wouldn't necessarily be the audit process, but, that might be for the audit, but it also might be, we might want to
Well, it might make the most sense, since we're gonna have some system of check in place, that it'd be the same people that are getting audited for CEs that would also get audited for this at the same time. In other words, the letter would require them to provide the documentation related to the CE and the written proof of completion of this requirement. Because otherwise, when are we gonna ask for written submission?
And I would
So-
not suggest a whole separate renewals audit system, so.
So we may have opportunity if we do just say, let's add that piece that they have to certify that they've had these required continuing education courses or CPD courses or whatever, that they've met this requirement, and just require them to keep their documentation. We can, if we look at renewals, how many renewals do we have a year?
Well, there's about 600 on average a month, so. What's the math on that?
7,200.
7,200, there you go.
Okay, so 7,200 a year. And we have them keep their documentation for 4 years. Okay. So, I mean, well, what do y'all think? If 10% of people are audited, that's like 2,100 a year.
I guess my thought is that is a lot to do 100%. However, what do we do, what was our, I mean, we didn't have Breeze, so some of the systems were different when we had the other requirements implemented. But in terms of, so what would staff have recommended to us if we had the other requirements to ensure people had it? Because I would imagine holding it for 4 years, there's some people that may not get in that for the 4 years, and so how long do they keep it? So for spousal abuse and for the aging one was another one, how do we handle that?
How did we handle that when we required it back then?
Yeah.
Just that they attest on the renewal notice that they had taken that course. And it would have been checked through the auditing process, but we weren't auditing at that time.
So we had 100% audit for a while, because we were using MCEP, which was a firewalled proof of continuing education that the CPA had.
Did they collect that data?
I don't know.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah,
not
they
sh-
did. We had to send in proof to them. That's what it used to be like. And then they let the board know.
But Jeff, was that a one-time renewal requirement at the time? For the one-time, for existing licensees, they just had to certify on that first renewal?
Right, and I don't think MCEP Training Agency actually tracks specific requirements, just
Just number?
just the number of hours. Is that correct?
Well, if that's what,
But you would just document to us that they have like 36, 37 hours.
like, we had it all in that window.
Right. But we didn't have direct access to that. So they would certify on the renewal that they completed a one-time requirement.
They'd certify on the renewal that they did the one-time thing,
Right.
and then that would be it. If we ever caught them, kind of, or if people were ever caught,
Right.
we had reason to believe they really didn't, and they lied
And then
on
we would
that.
have the option to have them send it in,
Uh-huh.
if we had reason to believe that they didn't take it.
So are we gonna want them to keep that longer than the 4 years, or?
I would
you know?
think, yeah, we'd want them to keep it, so long as they're licensed.
I think that's why certify and maintain kind of worked.
Yeah.
There was no time limit. You just need to certify and then you maintain it. And
Okay.
upon our request is when you provide it.
Okay, that sounds good, because I would hate for them for something to happen, and then they don't maintain that because they've only maintained it for 40 years, and then, you've had reason to suspect. So if it's something they have to maintain.
Yeah, or they certify and they maintain for 4 years, and then in 5 years, for instance, there's a disciplinary complaint as a result of somebody having committed suicide, and they say they don't have the documentation anymore, that would be a time maybe we would want to look at the documentation to make sure that they actually had adequate proof of that. So, yeah, I don't think we want to put a time limit on it.
Okay. I guess in my mind, I agree with that, and then I think about just making sure there's no confusion and extra, I don't like that term necessarily, but extra burden. I feel like in terms of the other one-time ones that we have done, in terms of the spousal partner abuse and aging and long-term care, if we didn't require that from them, then I don't know if we should do something different this time. So I feel like our process should be consistent, and so I don't know, that's the only thing that gives me a little bit of hesitancy on saying that, because I don't think we put on anything else from what Ms. Noonan just said about keeping the documents. We should be explicit on what documents they should provide us, and then if this is the only one we're telling them to keep in perpetuity, it seems a little.
Well,
This-
you know, I agree with you. Let me just kind of respond to this, and I'll comment. I agree with you about that idea, but then the other thing is if we see something now, which to me is kind of a problem in our system, we're making these one-time, you know, we are saying you have this requirement, and then we, in fact, aren't really sort of holding them to that. In my mind, it's a bit of a public protection issue. I don't want to go too big on that, but I think it may have pointed up a problem in what we have required before.
I guess in my mind, Dr. Horn, though, I'm sorry, Dr. Phillips, but just to close off that comment, I think, though, then that's a bigger question about record keeping in general.
Right.
Because if the example that Dr. Phillips used about a question about a disciplinary process beyond this item,
Yeah.
all of them. And so in terms of our record keeping
Right.
for our licensees, seems like it might be a bigger hole in the system. But it just feels like maybe we start with this one to make some change. So I could be supportive of that, but I feel like in terms of the context of how we would make a decision, it sounds like it is a problem. This is maybe the first way, and we need to then recommend that we look at the others, because it sounds like it could be another area of disciplinary issues that we would want to have proof of their documents beyond 4 years, it might be, right?
I also wanted to point out during the period of these earlier requirements, all psychologists were reporting to MCEP.
Right.
So MCEP had a record of all the courses taken.
That's right.
So there was always a record that existed at MCEP that showed that they'd taken the courses at some juncture in time. Whereas now we've done a different process with the auditing, and as a result of that, we wouldn't have the same kind of paper trail. Does that make sense?
That's absolutely does.
It does, and then my mind goes, you said people can upload, so the upload that we get, how long do we keep the uploads?
We don't actually use that feature right now because we don't require anything upon renewal, so I'm not sure. I believe it's a lifetime. I don't believe that there is an expiration on those documents.
But there is an upload for a psych assistant renewal, and I would assume we maintain those in the system indefinitely.
So perhaps this is where the system could be fixed with, if we're using upload for one category and not all categories, when we can keep things for a longer period of time, maybe that's a way to address that. Because I do agree with you about, for this one in particular, if it's a requirement, we want to make sure.
Well, the thing is, everybody doesn't renew online.
Yeah,
So
that's what I was going to say.
you know, the uploads are for people who renew online, but obviously if they don't, then, you know, we're in the same thing. But we can say, you know, if they upload, it will be, if they do renew online, we don't have to say here, but I mean, we know that if they renew online, that will be kept, but it's their responsibility to keep it.
So let me ask this question. I know you're going to jump in, Ms. Johnson, so sorry, but just
Oh, I was gonna
along
say the
this
same
train of
thing.
thought, I don't think I've had this conversation before. How many people don't upload, and if the people that don't upload, well, how many people don't upload? What's the percentage?
How many people don't renew online?
I mean, thank you, don't renew
What do you-
online.
What percentage would you think, Jackie? It's hard for us to say because we don't see it. You know, we just do if there's an issue with their renewal, then it comes to us. Otherwise, they do it automatically online, or they go through our automated system. So it's hard for us to judge, since we don't see it, how many people do it that way.
How many people then, so if you don't renew online, you're submitting the paper to the office?
To our automated system. It doesn't even come to our office. Mhm.
So it would otherwise then, if they were to do it through the mail, it would go to cashiering.
Mhm.
They would get the check, they would
And they automate.
deposit the check, and they would input.
No, they don't input
Okay.
anything. They scan.
So then they stamp it and send it to you guys?
Um,
How does the actual update on the Breeze system occur?
So they have an automated system where they take the little paper renewal and they run it through the system, and it's uploaded automatically to Breeze. And if all the questions are answered correctly, it just gets approved automatically.
Oh, okay.
And if they don't, there will be a hold on the renewal. We get all of the renewals, and staff goes through and makes sure that they've all been renewed, and if they haven't, what was the holdup?
But they've already been run through the Breeze system by the cashiering
Correct.
office?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So if we got rid of that process, it would be so easy, but having that process also allows us to process renewals a lot quicker.
Which is a huge advantage, to be
Yeah.
able to renew faster.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think we have a larger issue, I agree with you, but maybe we can start here, but, putting that onus on the licensee and just saying, you need to keep this because.
So let me just ask a question, just kind of thinking this through. So if we did say what you were saying initially, submitting that document with your paperwork, if you didn't renew online, so what you just described is, you get the paperwork back from the cashier office, right? So theoretically, you would get that attachment. Could we then upload that, because in terms of, because I don't know, what do you get? You said you go through to make sure the application is complete?
So what happens is they all get run through the system, and if it's a perfect renewal, all of the questions are answered correctly, it's automatically renewed. And then the ones that, let's say they didn't certify enough hours or they missed a question, they won't get renewed. We still get every single renewal that goes through cashiering, just so we still have eyes on it and we still have our hands on it to make sure the renewal was appropriately renewed, there wasn't an issue with the system, and those that weren't renewed, we look at them and see why weren't they renewed, what happened, and we'll send them a letter, a follow-up letter. So the issue with requiring them to submit a documentation upon renewal, they're already being renewed, so even if they don't submit it, it doesn't matter. There's not gonna be a hold, because we don't have a way to hold it if it goes through cashiering.
No, I get that,
Yeah.
but you'd still get the document,
We still get
though.
the document, exactly, and then the other issue is when they send up the renewal applications, the envelopes are separated, so if there are additional attachments, they're gonna be in those envelopes, but they're all stacked in a different stack, and we actually have to go through them, and some of them don't even have the return address on them, so it just gets complicated.
So
So
my
what would we
suggestion
like-
would be some kind of attestation of compliance and then attestation and maintenance
Of the record,
of the
or
record.
the proof of.
And we may never know whether anybody's actually doing this.
But
American.
it is their responsibility in case something does happen. And I would think that most people would want to do that anyway, if there's a requirement like that, but.
I would think if they have to certify and
I
sign
think
that under penalty
that
of perjury.
It does, it
Yeah.
keeps the licensee responsible for their own, for what they've done. Yeah.
I feel comfortable with that, and I do think maybe this is an item for a future agenda, because that this process seems a little, like there could be a way to streamline it and make it a little stronger.
Right.
But I do suggest, I support that, and as Ms. Noonan was saying about explicitly putting on documents when you need to keep certain things, that would be great to walk through that.
Okay.
As a committee.
Okay, so that might be a future agenda item for licensing. Okay, so how do we want this to read now?
I'm sorry, can you expand exactly what you would like the future agenda item to discuss in terms of the statute and the licensing process? You're talking about changing the renewal process, or how we're gonna audit this, or what was?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear how you started
The
that.
future agenda item, can you explain more in detail what exactly you wanna see discussed in the future with this
How
item?
we as a board, get proof that have proof that people are doing these requirements, the one-time requirements. I'm not talking, it's clear how we have
The audits.
continuing education and auditing, that's fine, but just these one-time requirements.
So just a generic one-time requirement, how are we going to make sure that people are
Yeah,
are
yeah.
compliant? Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I would say the only thing, submit proof of compliance, and maintain it, though. They need to maintain it, so. And maintain,
What do you do at the bottom?
yeah, the very last one.
So not there?
Right at the bottom, no.
No, it'd be and maintain proof of compliance.
Submit and maintain proof.
We wanted to submit out, right?
Just so we're consistent with 2915 and it's in the current iteration in our Sunset Extension Bill, it is 2915B about certifying proof of compliance and then maintaining the documentation let's see. Certifying that he or she is in compliance with this section shall retain proof of this compliance for submission to the board upon request. You know what, it doesn't give a number of years. We might be doing that in regulation.
Well, this would be separate from the CPD since it is a one-time requirement separated from the 36 hours, so I think it would need to be specified in the section.
It will be part of the 36 hours if somebody does it in that way. Okay, Jason, line number 2,
Yes.
all licensees take out must proof of compliance and maintain must at the time of renewal, complete a one-time 6-hour course of risk assessment, remember that needs requirements is finished. Or 3, and maintain, no, they don't submit, they certify,
Right.
is what they do.
Right.
And certify and maintain proof of compliance, right?
Yeah, and just from a grammatical point of view,
Right.
all licensees must by the time of renewal, not at the time of renewal.
No, they're doing it at the time, yeah.
The fact that all licensees must, at the time of renewal, complete.
Yeah, at the time they're renewing their license.
I think it's by the time of the.
Oh, yeah.
At the time certified,
Yeah, that's
by the
right.
time.
By the time we complete the course. And, at renewal, certify and maintain proof of compliance. How about that?
And then perhaps
And
that's
at
where
renewal.
you want to say, maintain proof of compliance for at least 4 years.
No, we don't want to say.
We don't
Well,
want to,
aren't
we
you-
don't want to put a time limit on it.
We're
But
not
aren't you
putting
allowing the
time
training to also, if they did get training prior to this, so that wouldn't fall in within CPD? If you're allowing them to prove that they've gotten the training in their program,
Right.
so it wouldn't be a CPD requirement necessarily.
No, it
No,
wouldn't
but they
necessarily
can
count
get it
towards
from
CPD. But if
Right,
they took a
but
continuing
the-
education course, the
They
6 hours
can take it as
could
part of
count
their
toward
CPD.
continuing
Right, but
education.
I'm just saying, if, let's say that they got the training, prior to licensure, and they were able to prove that, the 4-year, you don't wanna, I'm confused.
So right now, it's the 2915 C2 and 3 are CPD in the categories of academic and sponsored CE
Right.
coursework.
Right, but aren't you guys saying that they don't have to take a course if they can prove that they've taken the training? So for renewal, it doesn't have to just be a CPD, it could also be proof of training.
But if you're auditing for the 36 hours,
They could either show that they've gotten a CPD
well,
course.
they could show a course if it counted toward the 36 hours, but they wouldn't otherwise submit any documentation to you.
Right, but
Because it's not getting counted toward the
But if someone were to
CPD.
say, well, I got this training, in my graduate program, I don't have to take this course then, right? I thought you guys were just saying that you were gonna allow that.
Just to, no, I think,
If I were to audit them and they would say, well, I took this course, my training director said I took this course, so here's proof of that, this is gonna be separate from my CPD.
Why
So-
couldn't it be both? I don't understand why it wouldn't be included in the 36 hours.
It
Because-
can be, but I'm saying if they already took the training, what if they don't have to take it as a part of the
Yeah, if
36
they've already
hours?
taken it, it wouldn't be part of their CPD, it would just be meeting that one-time requirement.
So we want them to still maintain that for 4 years, cause it doesn't specify that part of it, it just specifies in the CPD that they have to maintain their CPD documentation, but not necessarily a certification from the training director.
What we're saying, we're not putting a limit on this at all.
well, I think that's what, Ms. Noonan, I think that's what you're saying is confusing, that it doesn't have a cutoff for this particular
Right.
CE course.
Right,
That's
So if they did do it by CE, they would have to maintain proof of compliance indefinitely.
I get that part, yeah, that is obvious,
Right.
yeah.
But if they're counting it toward the hours, they would have only had to maintain it for 4 hours if there was going to be, or 4 years
years.
if there was going to be an audit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they could be both.
I do too. I think if we're saying you gotta retain this proof, period, indefinitely, I don't think they're gonna be confused about the fact that for CPD or CE, they only have to maintain it for 4 years. I don't think that.
So you don't want to put a time frame on it?
Correct.
Okay.
We do not wanna put a time frame on this one thing.
So should we make that more explicit? So that when a licensee reads the regulation, they know, I've got to keep this proof of compliance forever.
That's what we're trying to say.
See,
Right.
well, I understand that, but I don't know that in reading it, they would necessarily,
Then let's think about a way to say it, because we're also not saying that they have to complete the one-time 6-hour course. What we're saying is, they, as a requirement for the first renewal, they
Right.
have to meet the requirements basically in A,
right,
and show that they have, in one of these 3 ways. They got a director of training who shows that, they've taken a CE course that shows that, and that's the certificate of the CE course. And that's how, and they have to keep that proof.
of compliance so long as they're licensed as a psychologist by the state of
Right.
California.
So I don't think we want to say the one-time 6-hour course. I think we want to say they've met this requirement that we have up here, 6 hours of coursework in suicide. So I think we want to, it's not a one-time 6-hour course. We're saying the 6 hours of coursework in suicide risk assessment. We want to say exactly the same thing as we're saying up here. They have to, yeah, they have to demonstrate that they have met this requirement in one of these ways. They either took a CE course, that was 6 hours. They have a director of training from an applied experience that shows it, or they've got coursework that shows it. I think that's what we want to say there, right?
Right, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying, as a licensee reading the regulation,
Yeah.
I would be uncertain as to how long I was to maintain.
Well,
that for-
then we'll add that too, but I'm saying the first part is not that they have to complete a
Yeah, yeah,
6-hour
yeah, yeah,
course.
yeah,
We are saying that they have completed 6 hours of coursework in suicide assessment.
And/or applied.
Yeah, and/or applied experience. And they can do that in one of these 3 ways, and they have to maintain the proof of that indefinitely,
Indefinitely.
yeah.
I think I'm a little confused. What
They'll
I thought was,
certify to it, and then they have to maintain the proof.
what I thought was happening is, beginning in 2020, as a condition of licensure, applicants have to show that they've met this qualification, which I think is a little bit different from saying current licensees who are, people who are licensed up to January 1 of 2020, need to show that they've done it, but it's as a condition of renewal like CE. So I get if it's a requirement of licensure, that's gonna be maintained because it's gonna be submitted to the board with their application. I think I'm not clear about why there's a distinction if they're establishing it either because they, as part of their renewal, either it's sort of a brush up requirement, if you will, either they did it, got a CE course, or they show that they did it as part of their training. Why the maintenance of those documents is somehow different from CE? To me, there are two different things. One is a condition of licensure and the other is renewal, which would be consistent with what, anything else that they have to do in order to renew, which is to maintain it for 4 years or whatever else they have to
Well,
do.
part of what we're saying is we won't necessarily have proof that they've done that. That they have done this one-time requirement, if it's for renewal, because they may not get audited. And
Is that different from other requirements for renewal, law and ethics, cultural diversity, any other specific requirements for renewal? That they
not for
make,
any of the other specific ones, you're right.
so is there a way, is there a
Yeah.
reason why this is being distinguished from those other subject areas that are requirements for condition of renewal?
That's a good
And Ms.
point.
Marks, that was my question. I was saying I feel like we shouldn't do this one differently, but the conversation that came after that was the fact that it sounds like we don't know, because everyone won't get audited in that period of time. But then, I mean, I think that I'd want to even amend the item for the agenda for future meetings. It's not about one-time events. It's about the fact that only one of our categories of licensees uploads their documents. And if it's uploaded, it's forever, from what you just said, right? And so it sounds like that's a procedural question for us we can't require everybody to do that can't, but to even let people know that that's an opportunity, that then you don't have to maintain other documentation. But I kind of agree with you. I think it should stay the same, and we need to look at that whole issue about how we look at record keeping and being able to keep it. Because I think what puzzled me, or what gave me some pause, was when Dr. Phillips said, well, let's suppose 5 years from now, someone gets a disciplinary some action regarding this topic, and we've required it, but the 4 years have expired, and we don't know if they finished or not. How would we know that they had met this requirement? And if they've given it up after 4 years, or they haven't kept their records, we wouldn't know. But if it was in our system uploaded, we would have that for forever, I suppose.
But
Well-
not everyone is, the problem we have is not every licensee is going to renew online, and there are actual
That's right.
elderly licensees or technologically phobic licensees that don't even have computers.
That's right.
So that was my question. If we got those information, if we knew a percentage of how many people were actually renewing via mail, would it be worth our efforts to scan those documents if we do get them from the cashiering office? And that was when I was saying I think it should be on an agenda item for us to discuss the process, because I think that it's hard to say. It's like, without knowing some data on how much time that would look like, I don't think that we could get a good recommendation from staff about that. But if we could have some conversation about it, I agree that we don't want to prohibit anyone from renewing. But if it helps the system and our record keeping and ensure that our items are being addressed, it might be well worth having the conversation.
So maybe I can pull some statistics on how many people renew online, how many people mail it in, and then you're talking about people who mail it in actually uploading that information to the briefs.
Why don't we just
I'm
talk about
saying
the
an
process,
agenda
the
item
process,
for
yeah,
future.
just the process.
Yeah.
Okay, how about this?
I wanted to
Okay.
ask Mr. Thomas a question.
Uh-huh.
Mr. Thomas, in the past, when we've had these one-time requirements for renewal, although MCEP had records of what courses we had taken, what did we do? Did we have an attestation on the licensee renewal application? So it became one of the boxes.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
Okay, how about this? I think Ms. Marks is right. We don't, in fact, we do have these things we will have these things about law and ethics. We do have a box to check for law and ethics. People may or may not be audited about that. We're gonna have a box to check for this, and I think that's true. I mean, I think I don't want to do this whole big thing. Let's do it I don't think we want to assume that people are gonna lie. I think we want to assume that people are gonna do the right thing and do what they're supposed to. And we probably shouldn't put an extra onus on folks for this requirement. But I think, again, we'll look at the process as a better way of looking at this. And so why don't we just say exactly like we say on everything else, that they will certify or attest to that, or whatever you do, you check the box, yes, I've had this. People know they have to keep their documentation for 4 years, and that's the way it'll be.
Okay, so do we need to include language here? Because as Ms. Jones has suggested, we later want to maybe look at the process and the procedure around this and how we maintain documentation of this, and whether it comes to us or just remains with the licensee. Do we need to put in explicit language in here that authorizes the board to pass regulations that relate to this particular thing? Because this is a statutory change, correct?
It's a statutory change, yes.
So do we need specific enabling language that allows us to regulate the process?
I think the board has general authority to promulgate regulations.
Okay.
I mean, if you're, maybe you can have languages that says maintain proof of compliance is required by the board, and then if it's
As
covered by
required by
the
the board.
CPD,
Yeah.
if the CPD regs require maintenance of those documents for a length of time, then it would
Okay.
kind of be folded into that. I don't know that I would look at it any differently from any other basis for possible discipline if you're looking at whether or not somebody has engaged in negligent behavior or practicing outside their field of competence. It's going to be established in the same way as
This
anything
one
else.
thing's not gonna be, yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's look at the requirement. That's right there, complete one thing.
We've got 2Bs.
Do we also want to address that this is for individuals licensed prior to January 1, 2020? So that we're not capturing the people that are post-2020? Because they've already either done it in their training or their education or CE.
Yeah.
I actually want to pick up on something that Ms. Mark said. Maybe we need to move that language from the information in our packet as a one-time requirement for renewal effective January 1, 2020, because I think that piece gets taken away now. It does say one time here, but I think that her distinction about a one-time requirement for renewal was an important one, I think, that is not in this current language.
So we're,
So I'm suggesting that we put that clause in the document that we had in our actual board book as a one-time requirement for renewal, put that in front of the language effective January 1, 2020.
yeah, it says here one time, but we also don't wanna say one-time 6-hour course. We wanna say,
But I think for the part I want to make sure
Yeah.
we get is the one-time requirement for renewal. I think that phrasing is
as a
important.
one-time requirement for renewal.
And maybe it goes after effective, but either way, I think it should be a standalone
Okay.
phrase.
I like that. It's a one-time requirement for renewal, and this is for people who were licensed.
For all individuals licensed prior to January 1, 2020.
Yeah. Comma, as a one-time requirement for renewal, comma. Individuals must,
I guess it's section there.
yeah.
No, you just put it, I don't think you want to delete all that, do you? As a one-time requirement.
Because it's already in the first line.
No.
Requirement for the first renewal after the effective date.
Okay, no, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I guess it is there, but having it in the very beginning, it makes it stand out a little bit more. But I'm okay if we keep it as it is. But I feel like, I thought that when I looked at the other document, it did stand out more and it addressed that question for people that were licensed prior to this time.
Effective January 1st, 2020, for all individuals licensed prior. For all individuals
License prior to that date.
licensed
prior to that day?
prior to the effective date.
Are they individuals or are they licensees though?
Individuals licensed prior to that date.
They're not licensees? I mean, I don't know the
Yeah, they are,
distinction.
but we're saying individuals
I think
licensed,
because we say
licensed individuals.
licensees right after, we just didn't want to use the same word. Right. Is it one-time crop farm or for those licensed?
We're not sure where you're at because you guys are going back and forth between participants.
For all for those individuals licensed, is that?
Prior to the effective date. I think it's just, sorry.
Is that what you were saying? For those licensed prior, but those individuals prior. Those, is it all? Must by the time of renewal. Must complete,
So getting rid of everything that's blue.
yeah.
Licensed prior to January 1st, 2020, must by the time of renewal complete. Now, this is,
We're not saying they have to complete a 6-hour course. We are saying, they must meet the conditions or must have met the conditions required in this statute, essentially, is what we're saying. In other words, and retain proof of that. So what we're saying is, you know, you're gonna certify it on renewal, and you're gonna retain the proof as required by the board.
And suggest that they must have complied with the provisions in A.
That's it. For the first renewal after,
Don't we already say as a one-time requirement? And
We're
if
gonna
they
remove
didn't-
all that.
Is it, I'm getting confused between the two B paragraphs.
take out the,
So this way, you're going to have that they must, by the time of renewal, have complied with the provisions in A and certify.
and certified.
And is it by the time of the first renewal have complied? Is that what you're trying to?
That's what you're trying to do,
Yeah.
right? It's a first renewal after January 1, 2020 for those licensed prior to January, right? Yeah.
Not any.
Next line, Jason. Second line, yeah. Put a
With.
comma there.
With the provisions.
And then don't you need an or, and then put in the 6-hour class?
No, because the 6-hour class
No, that's
is also
third
an
and
A.
fourth.
One of those.
Yeah, got it.
And would it be provisions or just provision, singular? Because you're doing it one of three ways.
Or A provision.
With the provision.
provision or provisions in there.
You're not supplying with more than one, you're
Right.
supplying one of them.
Was it part of one of the provisions?
Can we just say, have complied with A?
You can say subsection
Yeah, subsection A, there you go. And we're saying, and certify, Is that just on their renewal form? Okay, we want to say that, don't we? Certify on the renewal form and maintain,
Proof of compliance as required by the board, right? Don't we want to say that?
I don't
isn't
think
that
so.
what they're doing? We don't have to say on the renewal form, just certify?
As required by the board is the process, I
Okay.
think.
Can we end the sentence with subsection A and then say, proof of compliance with this section shall be met by certifying on the renewal and maintaining proof of compliance?
There you go. A lot better than trying to put it all
I
in
think
there.
that, do we want to say on the renewal form though, Ms. Zorick? Because I think that the as required by the board, I think
That might
Yeah, both of those
cover
are
it.
fine, yeah. So, proof of compliance with the section shall be
Certified.
and,
And the
and the
licensee
Licensee shall.
shall maintain.
Now, how does that match up to the language in SB 11, whatever, in terms of how we did it? Because I thought
2911.
the new language that you were reading from, because I felt like it didn't have the form, and so I think it would be good to at least start off, those would be equal.
Each person who applies to renew or reinstate his or her license. Oh, we don't talk about reinstatement. Should we cover that here? We might need to, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Renew or reinstate,
renew or reinstate.
because we want to capture those people as well, if that's what you want.
Absolutely, we do.
So each person who applies to renew or reinstate, and I'm reading from the language that's in our sunset extension bill. His or her license issued pursuant to this chapter shall certify under penalty of perjury that he or she is in compliance with this section and shall retain proof of this compliance for submission to the board upon request.
Can we just take that language and
Yes.
put it in here
I
rather
agree.
than, okay.
It's much clearer, I think.
We also use the word reactivate, I don't know.
I'm
Yes.
sorry?
Reactivate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
reactivate is usually the most common term that we use when someone goes from inactive to active, so I'm not sure
Okay.
if you want to use that instead of reinstate. Even though I know
Well,
it's in the language.
reinstatement needs to be in there as well.
Oh, I see,
Because
okay.
that's a different process.
So it's
Okay, I thought it was the same.
renew, reactivate, or
Or
reinstate. And if I can just point out something, A says, an applicant for licensure is a psychologist applying on or after January 1st, 2020. And then B states, for those licensed prior to January 1, 2020, what about those applicants who are not licensed yet that applied prior to January 1, 2020? Because then you've got a whole nother group of people that, just as it's written here, are exempt from that requirement, which is not the intention.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know how to fix
So
it.
then rather than looking at it as the time they applied, you want to look at it at the time.
Issuance
Of
of the license.
issuance of license?
That's why it was originally effective January 1, 2020 for one-time renewal. That way you're capturing everything.
The only issue there is somebody who applies in December of 2019, not realizing that they're not going to be issued a license until after January 1, 2020, and is told, oh, you don't meet the requirements. Because they only have control over when they submit it to the board, not when the board reviews their application.
Where are we
Would
saying
those applicants also come up on their first-time renewal under subsection B? So
Well, except
even
that they, as Jeff points out, they won't have been licensed prior to
And
January.
that's why,
Right.
if we go back to our original language in KZ, it said effective that date upon your first renewal, it captures all of those. So if we go back down, so B, when you have it here effective January 1, 2020 as a one-time requirement for renewal, reinstatement, or reactivation, if you get rid of that license prior to January 1, 2020, you don't create that third group. You go back to just effective on this date as a one-time requirement for renewal, reactivation, or reinstatement.
But
They
then,
must, and that way you
some
won't-
people would have to comply with it twice.
How?
Well, if they,
if you're applying on or
Up-
after January 2020, you're going to have to demonstrate this. if you were licensed prior to January 2020.
But you're saying to take that out, right?
That's what I'm saying, take it out, because after that.
So if you take that out, then somebody who's already complied because they applied on or after January 1st, 2020, they're going to have to do it upon renewal because it's not
Their submission
explicit.
of the documentation would be the same that they have already.
Well, how about if it said for those individuals not licensed? Prior to January 1, 2020.
Why in the world are we?
So what are you suggesting to add?
Prior to the issuance?
So I guess my point is they would have already submitted it as part A, so they would certify on their document that it was already completed as part of
Wouldn't be
A.
a big deal.
Even if they were audited, they could certify that they completed it.
And we would have that documentation already as part of A.
Right, we, in one case, one case, we definitely already have that.
Exactly.
Um,
So I guess maybe I'm seeing a distinction without a difference. So you've already submitted it to us upon your first initial application, or you're certifying, yeah, I submitted it to you already, that I've already done it, and you already have it.
But I think it's going to create confusion for relatively new licensees. They're going to think, am I supposed to be doing this again, or can I certify based on what I did prior to the time my license was issued? And I think they'll probably get telephone calls about it.
And that is an opportunity for us to put out prior advisories that attempt to clarify from a staff perspective.
We don't want to lose people, in this, and so what we're saying is, first of all, if you apply for your license after January 1st, 2020, you're going to have to demonstrate part of your application is going to have to include proof of this. If you are renewing your license effective that date, then you have to demonstrate it from then on. So what you're trying to do is capture the people who've already applied for license, but they're not licensed yet,
Right.
and, but they submitted it prior to January 1st, 2020.
Correct.
Yeah, so if January 2020 is when this goes into effect, is that what the deal is?
But I'm wondering if I think that part of the reason we were doing this in this way was that we were saying that we wanted to capture those folks, that their curriculum doesn't provide that. We've already said that most of the people have it at this point in time. And if you were a licensee, you could submit your academic, your postdoc
Why don't we just
information.
say this?
And so I think that the way it says a one-time renewal requirement for either renewal, I think reactivation or reinstatement should be included there. I think you aren't losing that many people, so I think that it would cover it if it's a one-time renewal, because you can submit stuff from your coursework pre-licensure.
Why don't we just say effective January 1st, 2020, an applicant for licensure as a psychologist shall have completed a minimum of blah, 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 blah. And then,
We're up on A.
at the very beginning, at
Yeah.
A, effective January 1st, 2020, an applicant for licensure as a psychologist shall have completed a minimum of these
Yes.
ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then the B part is anybody renewing
Yeah,
their license.
there we go.
Right.
There
we
Yes,
go.
that'll capture it.
Okay. Right, for the first renewal after that, then you'll do it.
So you're wanting to incorporate both into A?
No.
No. Just A needs to read effective January 1st, 2020, an applicant for licensure.
So you're applying for licensure, effective this date, you gotta do this stuff. B
Right.
is if you're renewing
Or reinstating, or
or reinstating or reactivating as of this date, you have to show proof or take a course. Right? That's essentially what we're doing.
So get rid of, yeah.
I'm understanding this, it's an applicant who applies as of the effective date or later,
Yeah,
would have to show proof.
right.
And anybody that fell before that period, including the people that have applied before January 1st, 2020, but have yet to receive their license, on their first renewal would have to demonstrate. Oh, well, that kind of cleans it up.
Doesn't
doesn't
that clear it up? If you mind, huh?
To me, the way, that's how this one reads, so
Uh,
I'm supportive of that.
Yeah, okay.
So is that correct, the way it's?
January first, applicant for licensure shall as part of the application. Okay, so that's the applicant. Now what's B? That's this.
Can we get it? Can we scroll down to B?
Renewal reactivation, incident, take up license, renewal license prior to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because now we come to
Yeah.
Yes.
Must by the time of the first renewal.
Are we okay with that, folks? Okay. Now, we still have to take public comment, we have to move something, and it is now 12:25. So I want to think about how we want to do this. I don't know how much. Are y'all okay to kind of keep going till we finish this number 5? Or are people starving and y'all are supposed to have a break and we need to do that? What do we need to do? Whatever your pleasure.
Can I suggest that we do some cleanup on the language for the 1193 compliance that you guys mentioned? So
Yeah.
it has the same language in B.
Yeah.
Walk during lunch.
Okay.
And then when we come back, we'll have something clean up there for you.
Okay, so that sounds like we probably should take lunch, and I know public hasn't gotten to talk, but does anybody from the public have to leave? Okay,
I just have to be back in the Bay Area by 4.
okay. I think it should be all right.
And hopefully.
Hopefully it will. If, yeah, we reconvene at 1:30. Would you like to maybe give some comment at this point in time? If you're here or not, you know, huh? Right. Exactly, so, we don't want to stop you from giving your comment if you have to leave early or whatever, so.
No, Gordon Dowdy, American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. I don't have really a whole lot to say. I'm very pleased with the process that we went through. And I think with the high percentage, according to the surveys that you took of those that are recovering, I think that this provides the full board with some options so they can see things are not really as cut and dry. There's a lot of variables here, where it may not necessarily be an inconvenience for a lot of folks. I think we have, with some cleanup, a winning product here. I'm gonna be happy. I've always had concern about the idea of the continuing education units versus the other language in the statute, and whether or not they could be divorced if the CEUs look like they're going down in flames. But I think the option's there, so it should not be that much of a burden. And I want to thank you for your work on this. I know it was a struggle.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take a break. Did you have something else you wanted to say, Sheree?
Just making sure there wasn't any comments, so.
Okay. We're going to take a break.
I do have a comment. I'll wait until after lunch.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, we're going to do that. We're just wanted to make sure he got his comment in case he had to leave. Okay, so we're going to break for lunch. We're going to be back at 1:30, and we'll resume the licensing committee then. Okay, the Licensing Committee of the Board of Psychology is back in session, and we are, let's take a look at what is there now. Y'all cleaned up the language a little bit over lunch, so if we could start at the beginning, or I think we are okay until that last part, but let's just make sure. Okay, so on number 2, obtained as part of his or her applied experience. Applied experience can be met in any of the following settings that meets, you mean that meet the requirement, or settings, that's right, practicum, internship, or formal postdoctoral placement that meet the requirement of Section 2911 or the requirements of Section. Oh, it's the formal postdoctoral placement that meets. Yeah,
yes.
so we have to, let's do this differently then. Practicum, internship, or in a formal postdoctoral placement that meets the requirement.
That messes up your setting, right?
Meets the requirement of, oh, that's right, it's practicum, comma, following settings, practicum, internship, or formal postdoctoral placement that meets, yeah, that's right, I'm sorry, Section 2911. I would put a comma in there, even though I know it's not, we don't typically do that before the last thing in a list, because I think, or other qualifying supervised professional experience. Okay, so far, can you move it on up then, Jason? So. Looks okay to me. Stephen? All right. So this looks all right. It's got everything we want in it, right? Okay, so the next thing we do we take public comment before we make a motion, or do we make a motion and then we have public comment?
You can do it either way you want. If you want to make the motion so that the public comment is directed to the motion, reflecting the action that the board is interested in taking, you can do it that way.
Okay.
So I move that we accept the statutory language for 2915.4.
I second the motion.
So it's been moved and seconded that we accept this statutory language for 2915.4. Any other board comment? Okay. Any public comment on this motion that's before the board? Or committee, sorry. Here he comes.
Thank you very much. Dr. Joe Linder Crow, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the California Psychological Association, and I just do have a few comments and a couple of questions and observations about this. And I realize that your process makes it necessary to go completely down in the weeds, and now I'm going to need to bring you back up to the 30,000 foot view for a minute, if that's okay. In the context, and I think Dr. Phillips had referred to this idea before, just to set it in context and sort of full disclosure, the California Psychological Association has typically, over the past number of years, opposed any specific content area for continuing education. And so I will say that doesn't mean at all that CPA doesn't think that any of these kinds of things are not important content areas for psychologists, whether it's on aging or the LGBT community or diversity courses or ethics or suicide risk assessment and prevention. But I do want to put it in, put your discussions in a larger context to give you a bit of an insight into how CPA as an organization will probably be looking at this. And that is to say that in the history of AB 2198, Levine's bill in 2014, we did oppose that bill, again, not because we don't think psychologists should have the very best information possible on suicide assessment and prevention, but that it seemed from our perspective to be targeting the wrong group of people. So targeting, making the requirement for psychologists who are the best trained among any mental health profession, instead of focusing on other professions, we felt was inappropriate at that time in 2014. For example, that bill did not include physicians. And we know from all of the information that we have, a great deal of research, many studies, many reports from NIH, the American Association of Suicidology, many other organizations. We know that anywhere from, depending on the age group, anywhere from 50 to 70, sometimes 90% of individuals who commit suicide have seen their primary care physician within the last year, for example. We know that there, for example, in one study in 2002 and 2003, 46% of adults, sorry, I have to read this, 46% of adults with suicidal ideation received any mental health care. And yet 50 to 70% of older adults have seen a primary care physician within 1 month. 90% suicidal youth have visited primary care physician during the previous 12 months. And so, and we know that 80% of people who have suicidal ideation have a psychiatric illness at the time that they attempt suicide. So our concern is, and our question for this board is, what exactly is the basis that you have for doing this, for requiring that psychologists have this course? I guess I would like to know that there is some real strong reason for you to take this step. I would ask, is the Board of Behavioral Sciences going to do the same thing for master's level mental health professionals? It seems to me that we are going down a path where the people who are the best trained in mental health are going to be the only people who are going to be required to take an additional course in suicide risk assessment and prevention. So it's of concern Because, again, knowing that, yes, of course, we want every psychologist to be well-informed, but it just sort of going back to the committee's earlier discussion when you first started talking about this, was how does this sit in the context of, for example, all these other courses that are required? And I think that at the time, and Ms. Jones raised the kind of the idea that it was a much broader conversation when the committee originally had this. So how is this going to fit into everything else? And I know there are a lot of moving pieces because you have pathways to licensure and so are you going to think about, while you're adding this course, are you going to think about taking another course away that's a pre-licensure course? And the generalizations that come up in these discussions concern us at CPA. Again, it's a very complicated conversation because it is such it is a crisis, not only in California but in our country. But I think we should be very careful about how we analyze what the solution is to the crisis and whether or not this is really a tool that will ultimately actually save lives. Now, I know that this board can only deal with this board's business, but I wanted to give you sort of the whole context so that you will have some insight into how we as an organization at CPA will be looking at this, because we will be looking much more broadly, and we will be looking at saying, well, what about other mental health professionals? Are they going to be required to do this as well? What about physicians? Are they going to be required to do this? And I hope we're not going down a path that's just the easiest path to take. I also wanted to ask a question because, Ms. Sorek, you said earlier, you referenced Mark Levine and that he might have some interest in this. So I wanted to be clear so I can kind of report back to my constituency. Are you suggesting that if the board approves this language, then the Board of Psychology would initiate legislation to make a statutory change? That's what I've gotten from the conversation, that this board would initiate statutory language that would only apply to psychologists.
That's the language we're discussing right now.
Okay.
Is changes to the Business and Professions Code.
Okay, so we can assume then that if you approve this language, that means that the Board of Psychology is going to sponsor a bill to make statutory change in this area. Okay. I think that's really all. It's a very, as I said, it's an awkward position to be in. It certainly is not the case that CPA doesn't think that this is an important issue, an important area, an important problem that we all need to work on to solve. And we have presented courses on suicide risk assessment and prevention. We will most likely have another course at our convention in the spring. We are really trying to focus on this to bring information to psychologists and to the public. We have on our website right now that it's Suicide Prevention Month, and we have links to all kinds of information. So I certainly want to make that clear. But I do have some concerns, and I think that CPA would have to really look very carefully, obviously, once the board considers this language, but that we would need to bring these issues before the full board. Happy to answer any questions. I hope that my comments are clear enough.
I want to thank you for those comments, Dr. Linda Crow. I'm not sure if any committee member wants to respond to her comments at this point in time, or, okay, Ms. Jones?
And I guess it's not really in response to Dr. Linda Crow's, but I guess her comments. Thank you, though, for bringing that up. I guess a question to staff, because I know that as part of our work after the veto message came down, we also did the survey, but there's also a task force of folks, right, that were meeting, and I think that, to that question about what other boards were doing, wasn't there some communication with the other boards, as you mentioned, Board of Behavioral Sciences, excuse me? And I'm just wondering, are those meetings still happening?
I thought that wasn't that Schwarzenegger who had appointed a task force earlier, and that was?
No, I'm talking about after this bill, so
Okay.
after, in 2015.
The governor's office convened staff members from the medical board, from the Board of Behavioral Sciences, and the Board of Psychology, and they asked the boards to compile data about what is currently being done. So initially, our inquiry went out to schools. The Board of Psychology did not get a lot of responses back. Then we reached out to training programs, which on that end, we got an overwhelming response that this was happening. I don't want to put words into his mouth, but I believe at the last board meeting, Dr. Harlem expressed a sentiment that even though we know this is currently happening, a snapshot in time, we want to make sure this continues to happen and continues to be the case, that training programs are providing this to their trainees. So kind of where we've come from and where we've been, that group of people from the three boards has not met since. There was some question and discussion about a broad statutory change or implementation to address current licensees. Continued professional development was looked at as a model because the other two boards do not have that. But we haven't heard anything since, so no further direction from the current administration.
So if I may just comment, AB 2198 was initially patterned after a bill that passed in the state of Washington, and it's gone on to 5 other states. It did not include our family care physicians, those folks, the primary care folks. For the reason is the heavy lobby of the American Medical Association. So AMA got involved, and they decided that they would drop primary care physicians and got the bill passed. We followed suit with not including primary care physicians. The following year, the state of Washington passed legislation that included primary care physicians. So it was just one of those things, getting it on the books and then getting it down, getting it good, I guess. We have met with the Board of Behavioral Sciences. We were unsuccessful in getting the topic on the agenda. So we just had to talk a few times under public comment. They did their survey, I think that was January when you did your first survey. They did theirs, and were quite pleased. They said, oh, we got this covered. But they really don't follow their educational requirements, according to their sunset reports to the legislature, that basically it's, if you pass the tests and get your license, you're good to go. And it's up to the educational institution to have all the requirements there. So we're hopeful if the board were to pass this legislation, it may give us an inroad to go back and talk to BBS and to see if we can get any interest there. I agree primary care physicians need a lot of training in this area. And so do marriage family therapists and licensed clinical social workers and professional counselors and school counselors as well. And so I just hope that this would be the first step in us expanding and getting others involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have something you wanted to say? Thank you all for your comments. So if there's no more public comment, no more board comment or discussion, we have a motion, so. Yeah, Ms. Jones?
I guess I have a comment. And so I guess quite a few things are going through my head as I sit here, and I think that, I think a couple of things that I think that should be considered is I was thinking back on the history of kind of where we are, and keeping in mind that initially as a board, we did vote to oppose the bill as it went through initially, and then we also had Dr. Harlem come back to us and make this recommendation and think through all this stuff. So I think that, I feel like, and given kind of the statistics and the whole idea of utilizing, I think you said it, Ms. Sorek, the continuing professional development model as a way to address this. It was like, like we're addressing like an important issue as it comes up, so it was a one-time thing. And then when we had so much coursework for people already, it's been good. So you can see lots of things just rolling through my mind. And then thinking about not wanting it to be a burden, and I feel like you said earlier, don't want to make it an inconvenience. And then part of me feels like I totally object to that even description of this as a burden or an inconvenience, because the importance of the education part, given what we talked about. But I think I'm at a loss, kind of as where do we go? And I think that, I guess I wasn't as articulate initially when I was saying let's take it step by step. But I also just feel like, I guess the full board's a place to have the full conversation, if not here. But I feel like to keep pushing it back and forth doesn't feel very useful to me. But I feel like I hear what you're saying, Dr. Jolanda Crow. I don't want to call you Gordon, but I can't think of your last name right now. But
I'll respond to Gordon.
but with much respect, in weighing out all of these issues, I think that I don't know. Maybe we do, because I feel like, again, I think that hard work, and I kind of feel like I don't want to just offer up a thought for staff to do more work, but it would be interesting to hear about if anyone's else taking up the banner, and if they're doing anything with it. But we already know about BBS, but the other folks that were in that meeting and somebody else doing stuff. And I feel like the language that was used last time at the meeting, you were saying that it was an opportunity for us to create the path for people to do more. So I feel like all those things kind of are in my mind, and I don't know, I feel like that's the context the discussion should happen at the board, which I think that was the part that didn't happen to me at our May meeting, because I think that it's a tough issue, and I know we've dedicated way more time a day than we thought we were going to, but I feel like that's kind of where we're at. So I guess that's just my thoughts. I don't think that's any resolution at all.
Well, now that you've made those thoughts, I'm gonna kind of echo them in a certain way. As a psychologist, and knowing the research, and knowing actually that it's not the mental health professional who doesn't see the suicidality of somebody. Again, I don't want to say that this isn't an important issue. Of course it is. But it's typically not the mental health professional. It's the family care physician. It's a family friend. It's friends of people. Sometimes the system doesn't allow. You've heard the story of many parents who tried to get an adult child in for help, but the system wouldn't allow that. It's not, again, I'm saying this as a psychologist, it's not happening at the level of the psychologist's office where an assessment is being done. That's not where I think things are falling off the rails. And so as a psychologist, I have the same, I have that reaction, I find it somewhat offensive as a psychologist who's had the training and, works in this area. However, as a board member, and kind of thinking about this is an important issue. It's really an important issue for public protection, I think. I think anywhere that we can make inroads, I do recognize that this is not where the most where the most happens. It truly is not. People don't come to their mental health professional with this issue. Not that suicidal people don't come, but I mean, people, that's not where they go. They talk in code, kind of, to their family care physician. That's who's really getting the bulk of it. If a professional is, they talked in their schools to their teachers, or the counselor at school. They certainly talk to their friends. And, but again, because this is an issue, it's a very serious issue, I believe as a board member now, that I do want to, I think, make the statement, this is important, and we just want our folks to know this is important. And if you've had the training, great, just signify that you've had it. But if you haven't had any exposure to it, you have to have it. You know, we want to say that you have to have it once. So I do think we want to bring a recommendation to the board. I totally agree with that, whatever that is. So that's kind of where I'm coming down, so.
I guess I would also just add into the discussion a little bit. I guess I see this more as a consumer protection issue than a competency of psychologists issue, because I think psychologists by and large are competent or highly competent in this area. And many of us have received fairly extensive training as it relates to this. So I think for existing psychologists, there's obviously problems with age and number of years since they've graduated from programs, and it might be more difficult for older psychologists, but I do think it's important that we say affirmatively, we are trained to do this, whether it's because I did it during my internship years, or I did it in graduate school, or I've decided to take a continuing education course. And I'm not so concerned about what other boards are doing. I think psychologists are the most competent mental health professionals as it relates to the delivery of psychotherapy services and a variety of other kind of psychological services. But I don't think it's wrong for us to set the standard high for psychologists and expect this of them, given the gravity of the problem and how much suicidality is growing in our society. So I think as a member of a consumer protection board, I feel like this is the appropriate way to move forward. As a psychologist, I think about it differently, but I'm really not being asked whether it's going to be convenient for me. I'm being asked as a board member what's in the best interest of the public, I think. And I believe this is in the best interest of the public.
Okay, thank you. Is that it for our discussion, board?
And again, I before we take the vote, and I guess I'm speaking assuming that it might pass, but I feel like if we do have this conversation at the board, I think that it needs to be a fuller, more detailed report for the board documents. And it almost makes me think at some level, people reference studies and this kind of thing. If there's anything that we think should be added on there, I think we should include that so we can have that kind of a discussion, because I think not just the language will tell this story that we're discussing today. So if staff could make sure that if it does pass, that that's in the board book for November, that would be most appreciated.
I think we definitely want to bring the fullness of the discussion we've had to the board when we bring our recommendation. Yeah.
It is, I think, unfortunate, and certainly on a personal level, it's unfortunate that Dr. Harlem is no longer with the board. I think we all enjoyed working with him. But he also had done a tremendous amount of legwork in terms of looking at the research, looking at the recommendations. It might even be worth telling him as a member of the public that this is going to be coming up on our agenda, because I know it was a very important issue to him, so they can come in and give us the benefit of his thinking and the research that he did. But I think I also agree with Ms. Jones. We need to either move forward with this or not move forward with it, depending on what the ultimate feelings of the board are, and that will be that. I certainly don't think from a political point of view, not that that's a primary consideration, if the governor's office can't think that we took his recommendation seriously, that we take a look at this issue and that we see what we need to do, if anything, to address the issue.
Ms. Sark?
Just for board meeting preparation, so we want to make sure we have the desire of the committee met in the supporting documentation. Would it be helpful to put a chronology of the issue, the going back to when the bill was introduced, the position that we took, a brief synopsis of why we took that position, attach the governor's veto message. I know we've provided this in the past, but just to make sure we have all the documentation together, the survey results that we got, and if there is any other information aside from those things, if you can let us know. That way we can make sure to have a full packet for this item.
I would also suggest, so if, to the extent that there's any kind of summary, whether it's from the minutes or otherwise, of Dr. Harlem's material that he presented to the board, that also be included in that package for people's consideration, so that we're really making a well-informed decision based on the, all the work that's been done on this issue.
And I think, Ms. Sorek, our opposed letter did some of that too.
All right, shall we vote on this motion, which is before the committee on, could you read our motion, please? Somebody?
It was moved by Jones to accept the language and seconded by Phillips.
And did you want to specify that that was for forwarding to board for recommendation for pursuing a statutory change?
I think it was in there about the statutory change.
Yes,
Yeah,
statutory language.
yeah.
But I will accept that friendly amendment in any way, Ms.
In
Mark.
case it's not in there, yes.
And second the friendly amendment.
Okay. All right, then let's call the vote.
Horn,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Phillips.
Did you say my name? I didn't hear it.
I did.
Okay.
I apologize. Phillips.
Aye.
All right, so that motion is passed. In this current form, it's going to the board. Now we are moving on to agenda item number 6. Current licensing requirements. And these are part of, this is for 1193, am I right? Yes.
Dr. Horn, we didn't do anything with the minutes. I don't know if you wanted to do the minutes before we got to this, because I have the feeling we could get pretty far
Bogged
in
down
this
in this
process.
as well. Let's,
But that's obviously.
thank you for reminding me.
Mhm.
I definitely forgot about that, so. Let's go back to approval of the minutes from the June 30th, July 1st licensing committee meeting. Let me ask, are there any corrections or additions to the minutes?
There was so much there, it looked complete to me.
Yeah.
56 pages.
So do you want to move there, we accept them?
I move that we accept the 56 pages of minutes from our meeting on June 30th through July 1.
Second.
So it's been moved and seconded that we accept the minutes as written, from the June 30th, July 1st licensing committee meeting. All right, so any discussion about that? All right, then could we call the roll so we can see who's in favor of this? Oh, public, is there any public comment, I'm sorry, on our minutes, our 56 pages of minutes? Pretty hard. Seeing none, Mr. Glass-Steagall.
Horn,
Aye.
Jones,
Aye.
Phillips.
Aye.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Dr. Phillips, for
Thank
getting
you
this
for
here.
capturing everything.